Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar, Decision Support Tool Utility, Connecting with Decision-Making Processes. I'm Tasha Commandant, a senior scientist at the Conservation Biology Institute, and I'll be facilitating today. Just a few notes before I turn it over to our presenters. We are recording this session, and we will post it on consbio.org. Underneath products and publications, you'll see we have a webinars page. And when you come there, today's webinar will be posted here, the recording underneath featured recordings. You can view past ones as well as look through the schedule of upcoming webinars. All participants are in listen-only mode. We strongly encourage questions, so if you have those, either type them into the question field or click on the hand raise icon and we can unmute your line. So with that, I'm going to change presenters here and turn it over to you, Kathy, to introduce Holly.
Thanks, Tasha. I'm Kathy Dello. I'm the Associate Director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute and one of the CERC team members, and I'll be helping to moderate this webinar. And this is the fourth webinar in our series on evaluation of decision support tools and resources. Today, Holly Hartmann will talk about decision support tool utility and strategies to help integrate your decision support tool into the work of decision makers. Holly is the Director of the Climate Science Applications for Carpe Diem West. She's a leader in research related to the development of decision support tools for climate, water, and other resource management applications. Holly joined the CERC team in 2015 to help us develop and improve our decision support tools and resources. So this webinar series is targeted toward our CERC team members, but we do welcome participation from this broader network of those providing climate services. So Holly will talk for about 40 minutes, and then afterward we'll have about 15 minutes of question and discussion time. We're going to open up the question and discussion first to the CERC team members that are on the line and then to everybody else. So go ahead and use your hand raise function or type your question into the box. Tasha and I will be moderating both. Please tell us your affiliation as well when you're asking the question. And CERC team members, you should be able to unmute yourself when you wish to say something. So with that, I will turn it over to Holly.
Great, I can see your screen.
So I want to thank everybody for coming to today's webinar. We're focusing on one piece of looking at decision support tools and resources from a user perspective. Today we're focusing on utility, and I'll go into more about what that specifically means. I'm going to start off by looking at a definition of decision support. I'll go over a little bit of history about how this particular framework came about, and then I'll go into some more detail about the particular framework. Within utility, I think you can see from this graphic that if you were at the third webinar, you'll recognize that those three items under utility are about technical sustainability. What we're going to talk about here today is we're going to start off and look at an iterative risk management framework. We'll take a look at some other existing frameworks that have a little bit of utility in them. And then we're going to look at some CERC examples. And then we'll talk about next steps. So I'll make sure that the PDF for this that anybody can access will be updated. So next slide. So for those of you who've been on this webinar series before, recognize this slide, but I do want to start every time with the definition of decision support, just so that anybody who's new understands where we're coming from. That is, we're focusing on the definition of the NRC report on informing decisions in a changing climate, where decision support is about not just about producing and disseminating data and information, but also facilitating the use of that data and information specifically to improve the quality and efficacy of climate-related decisions. So that in particular is an appropriate definition for what we're going to talk about today. The background, the way I came to this was through my involvement in the Carpe Diem West network, which is a group of, it's kind of an organic network of water resources practitioners from the local to the national level, dealing with field implementation of projects all the way to kind of national policy. But everyone is focused on dealing with water resources in a changing climate. One of the real challenges that the Carpe Diem West network encountered was just confusion about so many tools being out there and having no confidence about what tools they should use and how they should use them to best effect. So we ended up coming up with this Carpe Diem West Academy in particular, which focused on looking at hundreds of tools to see which ones were most appropriate for our network members and provide some context for the use of those tools. It became very clear early on in looking at the tools that there were so many tools, hundreds of thousands. The first search, it went 70 pages deep in Google. That was a few years ago for legitimate descriptions of tools. So right away it became clear that simply content without context was very confusing and actually confounding. It stopped people in their tracks. So we came up with the Academy as a way to think about tools in a more organized manner, not just to inventory them and evaluate them, but to provide some context. So here's what they were facing. They were trying to recognize and evaluate the risks associated with climate change and other vulnerabilities and other hazards. They wanted to make the best use of available information, and they wanted to find the appropriate decision support tools for their specific context. And like I said, they were just overwhelmed by tools. And the other piece that became pretty obvious after looking at a range of tools that are out there is that so many tools are piecemeal. They really lack interconnections about how one tool feeds into another and then produces results to go on to another tool. No single tool does it all for any decision maker. So we were really then focused on trying to provide some context for those tools, and that's how the framework that I'll be talking about today came about. Now, I want to relate this to the CERC project and kind of where we are with our research questions. Today's webinar, like many of the others, that focuses on the first and the third of our research and development questions. That is, how can decision support tools effectively facilitate the use of data and information, knowledge development, and building adaptive capacity, and not just for one set of decision makers, but ultimately across scales, across sectors, and how to do this over time after a single decision support tool project may be over. And we want to be able to do it at a pace that's consistent with the climate adaptation challenge. And then the third question is in general, how should we be evaluating decision support tools and resources and their use? And that's a broad question. So that's why we're having so many webinars. And we have so many different frameworks. And the idea with these frameworks isn't that I'm saying that this is the way that each of the CERC teams has to change their tool. These frameworks are as much in development as any other part of CERC. So it's important to get feedback for those of you within CERC, and even those of you outside of CERC. I would like to hear your perspectives as well. Anytime, just send me an email. It's on that first slide. I'd love to hear your perspective about some of these frameworks too. So let's take a look at where we've come from. Here's the various frameworks that we have. The first webinar looked at one aspect of the decision maker and user perspective, focusing on communication and the usability of a decision support tool or resources. That is how somebody actually engages with the thing itself. We also talked about design principles and strategies and tactics. And then our last webinar was from a different perspective, looking at the whole climate applications enterprise perspective about how to sustain these tools over time. Today, we're jumping back to the user perspective, and we're focusing on utility. The next webinar will focus on suitability, which is another way of looking at a user's perspective about tools. And then we have several webinars on tap, I think, about the academic review of tools. So with that, I'm going to dive right into it. Here's the three parts of our framework for looking at decision support tools and resources from a user perspective. Like I said, we talked about usability already, at least from the language and format interpretation and thinking about different concepts. I'll do another webinar in the future about actually testing the interfaces and designing interfaces and doing some testing of that. I know that some of you are already involved and have some good insights there. Today we're focusing on utility, and I'd like to contrast that with usability and suitability. Utility asks, how is this tool useful for me? What is it that I can do with this to actually help me make a decision? Right? Usability focuses actually on engaging with the tool itself, and suitability gets at a decision maker trying to decide, out of all the tools that are out there, is this the one that is particularly right for me? So today we're talking about they've made a choice, and we're to use your tool, and we're going to think about how is this tool actually usable or useful for that decision maker and their context. We're going to look at the iterative risk management framework, and then a couple of other frameworks that are out there, and then apply that to some CERC examples and talk about the CERC domain with the knowledge to action networks and connecting with the policies, programs, practices, and processes of decision makers that CERC connects with. Right? So let's just start off with this. This is the iterative risk management framework. It's from the United Kingdom's Climate Impacts Program. It's nothing original to me or other group. It came out of the Climate Impacts Program, but through the National Academy Study Committee on America's Climate Choices that reviewed a number of decision frameworks. This iterative risk management framework was deemed kind of the most appropriate framework for thinking about decisions under a changing climate and dealing with the climate adaptation challenge. And in the work of the Carpe Diem West Academy, we have found that this framework really does connect with a wide variety of decision makers and contexts. And even if they have their own decision-making framework or process, kind of roadmap that they've laid out, they can map this framework right on top of that. Even if it's something like the Forest Service's Think, Plan, and Act, which is pretty basic, this framework can lay over that and connect to it. And I particularly like this framework because it says a lot about how decisions are made, where decision makers fit in, and where tools fit in of different kinds, tools of different kinds. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes with this framework, with this graphic. And I want to point out just to start that there's 4 basic components to this framework. That is, you can see the elements in capital letters and underlined. That is just to simply scope a problem, analyze a problem, make a decision, and then track the results. There's more focused activities that happen within each of those 4 categories, but that's just the basic framework. I'm sure you in your head can think of examples already where you can connect that with decision processes that you've been involved with. And I should point out that decision makers, or you as somebody who's facilitating the use of decision support tools and resources, may come into this framework at any place on here, not just starting at step 1, but you may come in at any place and have to fit yourself in or try to figure out what's going on. And your tool connects to specific places on this framework. So within scoping of a problem, people are trying to just identify the problem and the objectives that they have, and then they're trying to establish decision-making criteria. Typically, the tools here are not specifically focused on climate. There's some very generic tools just about how you think about a systems problem or any kind of issues where you're trying to just manage choices, manage dilemmas. Maybe you think you're solving problems, but often we're just managing dilemmas, right? Or making choices at the time. So once the problem is scoped, then we do some analysis. And it's not, I should say, often the people who are scoping the problem and those who are doing the analysis are different people. And you can see here that there's a loop here in the analysis stage where you're assessing risk, identifying options, appraising those options, seeing what they cost, for example, and looking at maybe what a build out looks like of a full implementation of options. And I think we may have all been involved in projects where folks do steps 3, 4, and 5, and then just go back to steps 3, 4, and 5, and seem to endlessly just do this analysis loop, waiting for new information to do a more detailed analysis. And it's hard to get out of that analysis loop. And many of us that come from, say, the physical sciences are often involved in these stages, these steps, to do the analysis. And we struggle with how to then pass a project on to the next stage. And that's, we'll talk more about that later. You can also see here that there's different layers within these blocks for steps 3, 4, and 5. And that really highlights that there's different kinds, different levels of analysis. You've sort of got the executive level kind of analysis, that is the 30,000 foot, maybe informing policy or programs. Then you've got kind of the nuts and bolts, or maybe just more of a checklist or guidance kind for field level implementation, where it's more, what do I need to do now, this month, the next year, or 18 months? What does my work plan look like? And then there's a really detailed kind of analysis for planning and engineering. And the kinds of analysis required by those different roles, I guess, within the decision-making process really do often look different. But there typically has to be some connection between the analysis results going across those levels. And I think this is the about the only framework that I've seen that really illustrates that within its graphics. So this is one reason why I like it. And it really drives home the point that we need to kick out from just this analysis loop into actually helping decision makers make a decision. They do need to make a decision, even if it's a conscious decision to table a decision. It's a conscious decision, not just one where they're stuck in an analysis loop. And so before a decision's made, they take a look at the output of an analysis, decide whether they really do need to go back and rescope the problem, whether values changed or participants in the whole process have changed. Do they need to change criteria? For example, if you're looking at some objectives that you have under the current climate, but you can't often meet those in the future. So you may be looking at something like nested objectives, more broadly defined objectives, and you've got to include criteria that meet those, that can handle those more broadly defined objectives, especially if you're looking at something like realigning your objectives or actually retreating from current objectives. So this part about making a decision, again, is often a more generic kind of analysis, and it's often not a single tool, but it's all about people making choices. So tools that help people engage and the facilitation of that conversation. And that's not necessarily a technical tool, although technical tools can be important for that. Reports and guidance can be important, but this is where people really come to the front as part of this whole decision-making toolbox, right? So, and then once a decision has been made, and it may be something that takes time to happen, even going through, for example, an election where there's a ballot measure, for example, to accept a bond, to fund something is a good example. That's where there's actually a decision is made, and then it's all moving on to implementation and then monitoring. And this implementing a decision gets back to work plans and looking at progress. And then monitoring is often more easily connected to those analysis tools. We don't often see tools specifically letting folks know that they can also be used, some of these analysis tools can also be used for monitoring. So I think that's a decent kind of introduction to this particular framework. It's what we've been using in the Carpe Diem West network that we used as part of the Academy. We had a series of webinars where we reviewed different types of analysis, like scenario planning or vulnerability assessment, looking at ecosystem services and so on. We were able to bring in tools, put them in this context of the framework, really focus then on how you take inputs from earlier within this decision process and then feed them on to the next stage. It really helped elevate the discussion by our members, and this is just my view. I think it helped them move to a different stage in thinking about climate adaptation. And I think, at least within the Healthy Headwaters program, which focuses on looking at water supplies throughout the whole system, from the head of the watershed down to the downstream users, it really helped them move from just looking at climate issues to focusing on, they're looking at financing and implementing now. So I do want to mention a couple of other tools or frameworks for looking at tools. We all know about the Climate Resilience Toolkit. There are some others that's connected out of the White House initiative under the last administration, where we've got climate.gov, the data.gov, which is looking at making data more available across all of the agencies, and then packaging it up in this Climate Resilience Toolkit, which then goes across agencies. Within the water domain, there's also the Water Toolbox, which is, I think, primarily headed up by the Corps of Engineers, but has wide participation across a range of agencies. These toolboxes or interfaces, kind of collections of tools, have a lot of information and tools and data descriptions in them. I think there was originally some goals to organize it maybe a little more thoroughly or within a more structured framework. You can see that within climate.gov, a past conception had a piece on supporting decisions that is not there now. And they focus primarily on maps and data and teaching climate. So there's a piece that isn't yet integrated into that framework. Within the Resilience Toolkit, you can see down here at the bottom of this graph, their framework that they've got. I think you can map it onto that iterative risk management framework, but you can see there's steps about just exploring your threats, assessing your vulnerabilities, investigating your options, prioritizing actions, and then taking action. It's not quite, in my view, it doesn't quite explain how we as decision support folks can really connect and help decision makers in quite the same way as that iterative framework does. But I do want to put these out here. It's things that if people have views about any of these toolkits or toolboxes and their frameworks that they'd like to see integrated into ours, let me know. So I want to come back to this. I'm not going to spend too much more time going over this, other than to say that in thinking about your own tools, I think it is helpful to think about where you fit and be able to explain where you fit, be able to explain how you're taking inputs from earlier in a process and feeding it out. This is a real challenge for decision support tools that are made for a general audience or a wide variety of users, because they have so many of their own decision contexts. So within the Academy, we also provided some curation frames of access for these tools. That is, some metadata or descriptions about these tools. And so the easiest one is to just focus on what stage of the iterative risk management frame you were focused on. We've got the big 4 categories, but we actually went down into all 8. The second way of categorizing these is to focus on the role in decision making. Is it for the executives? Is it for the field staff? Is it for the planners and the engineers? I might add one more in retrospect about communicating with the public, as or just the public and stakeholders as another role in decision making that I think within the Academy we didn't address so well. But I see the need for that in many projects. And then these others are more descriptive, and that has to do with the flow of information across tools. One is at the level of interoperability. We talked more about that in the last webinar on the technical side. This interoperability is more of a technical issue about data, map projections, formats, time scales, and so on, time steps, for example. The other is at what scale is this tool most appropriate? Is it a point tool? Is it something at 4 kilometers? Is it a large region, like an eco region? At what scale is it appropriate and inappropriate to use this tool? And then how do you go across some of these scales? How do you link inputs and outputs across tools that are working at slightly different scales? The third kind of element here is thinking about integrating your tools or specific components of your tools into larger suites of tools, collections of tools that a decision maker can come in and pull out the whole, what do you call it, a toolkit, or I even say like a makeup bag. There's analogies there, not just tools, but into a whole set of tools that start from the scoping and go all the way through to implementation. And that can be very helpful for getting decision makers to focus on a problem and actually getting to a decision. The next is looking at how your tool integrates with programs. That is something like a decadal program review, or a general stewardship plan, or a specific sort of recurring planning process that comes up, whether it's like land use boundaries for a community, for example. Knowing when those programs have to have certain activities done, and thinking about where your tool fits in those formal processes. Thinking about how do you get the outputs of your tools to be consistent with where they're needed in that timeline for a particular decision context. And if you miss that timing, you may not get a chance to have your tool make an impact for another decade. Right? So, and then the last in this, thinking about the flow, is looking at how your tool actually supports best available practices. And with a changing climate and some of these sectors like water, there is no really best available practice anymore. It's all still in transition. And so within the Carpe Diem West Academy, at least, we often talk about thresholds of acceptability rather than best practices. When does a practice become at least good enough for people to think about using it more often and replacing things that we know are poor practice? And then the last way of thinking about these, a frame of access for tools, is thinking about the flow across the roles and participants that are involved in a decision support process. That is, how do we do co-production with those decision makers and stakeholders? And then how do these tools support the decision makers in being innovative? That is, going before, if you're looking at somebody like a planners or engineers, program folks, how do these tools support them going to the executive level and getting permission or authority to innovate without having sort of career risk and institutional risk? And networks are a key piece of this, at least in my experience. And in this red box, I'd like to highlight that these two ways of looking at tools are not your typical technical way of looking at it, either from the physical sciences or the software development. And so I really want to highlight that these are the kinds of frames of access or extensions of tools where we really need cross-disciplinary expertise. We really need to think within CERC or other projects about how we connect across teams so that we aren't duplicating some of the efforts, or the efforts that we do are consistent, so that decision makers can see a consistent message, or at least they don't have to unlearn something as they're moving across these different tools. And it gets at this notion of co-production. Do we work with decision makers like the coastal group is doing, for example, or some of the others? And so I want to go in a little more detail in that and look at the CERC tools than some of our CERC projects. But I recognize that this is a real challenge, especially for the technically focused teams and what they're working on today. So let's look at the Northwest Climate Toolbox. We had a great discussion earlier this month with this stream team, and it was really helpful in thinking about how this framework connected with their toolbox. this is just the first screenshot, but within the toolbox, there is some really useful information for, say, water managers, fire managers, agriculture, that kind of provides some context, but there's still a lot that could be done that could help decision makers understand how these tools could really fit within their whole decision-making process, not just a particular need for analysis and then kind of being left to know, what do I do with this, left hanging. Within our discussion, the things that really jumped out is being able to identify where these particular tools fit within the iterative risk management framework. And within the challenge for the Northwest Climate Toolbox is there are so many tools in one tool, right? It's a toolbox. And so it's really helping with identifying with each of the functionalities within this whole toolbox about where it fits, because they do fit in different places. One advantage of having these tools all in this Northwest Climate Toolbox is it's easier to present a whole suite of tools that shows how they connect together. And I think that's some of the discussion recently about connecting with the central office and thinking about how in the some of the communications that come out for CERC, how this toolbox can get connected with that. The next piece that really seems like came out of our discussions was about how these tools connect with specific decision contexts. The team has their own set of stakeholders that they work with, but necessarily that's a limited number of stakeholders. And so is there anything that we can learn from other groups about working with those stakeholders that would help describe or present the story about how these tools fit within their decision context? Specifically, there's a real need for helping with packaging the results in reports and presentations. So as people are using these tools, that they can go to their executive level or their field level or to stakeholders and tell the story of what's coming out of those tools and analysis, because that's how you get to a change decision. That's how you get to a decision. And that includes actually communicating the results of the analysis, not just presenting a graph, but telling, but saying what that output means in the context of that decision. And that really, in my view, requires a cross-team effort. It's not something that the folks programming the tool necessarily should be doing or would be most efficient. And I also looked at the coastal futures. We haven't really had our consult yet, but I've sat in on a couple of the meetings, and there's some real maybe lessons for the other teams that can come out of this if we are trying to look across each of the streams. This process is very much a time and person intensive effort. Engaging with stakeholders, engaging with decision makers. It focuses on a specific location, in this case, Grays Harbor for this last year or so. So it's really a case study or a pilot effort. It really helps, I think, though, define what the design priorities can be for dealing with complex issues. It seems like this is a highly mediated use of decision support tools, is that there's a lot of engagement, and just in sitting in and listening to the Coastal Futures team discuss how to bring the stakeholder discussions in and integrate them in the tool is really enlightening about how much mediation is going on in the use of this tool and connecting with the stakeholders and decision makers. One of the issues is, from my view, is how scalable this effort might be. And so I would like to talk with the Coastal Futures team and see how they develop over time, where some of this could be more scalable. But I think there are a lot of lessons for the other streams about telling the story or bringing in stakeholders to understand how these tools connect with their decisions. And then lastly, I just want to look at the climate console and the data basin that CBI has. And this maybe is, I was really encouraged to see this, where they have a place within the data basin where you can go look at data sets that have been created with their data basin tools, the maps. It's not just data and maps, though. It's guides and case studies about how those tools and that data were used, not just for analysis, but actually in making some decisions. And then they have galleries where it helps tell the story of the decision context, how that data was connected in, and what came out of that. It would be really great to see some of the SERC tools put in this kind of format, or to look at this set. If you look at how many data sets, maps, case studies, and galleries are there, it's mind-boggling. But I think there's a lot of lessons in there, or examples, or things to build on for SERC tools in trying to connect our tools with decision making. So I just point that out as an example. And then to finish up, I just want to focus on the next steps. Here are the questions that I would have for the different teams, is sort of what networks, that is networks of decision makers, does your tool or your resources connect with? And it's beyond just an individual stakeholder, because if it's about supporting innovation and adaptation, it's through networks that you can scale that innovation. So that's where I'm asking, so what network do your tools and resources connect with? And then which specific decision processes is your tool supporting? Can you say, is it for a stewardship contract, for example, at the local level with the Forest Service? Or is it for something like a general resource management plan with the Park Service? Is it something with a specific bond measure in a community? Is it for a creation of an adaptation plan, for example? And then how does your tool support moving through that iterative risk management cycle? And I think I've said enough about it, but it's just to drive home, it's about the technical issues. It's also about packaging and communication of your products. And then it's about supporting the policies and programs. And then what we'll talk about in the next webinar with regard to suitability, it also connects with the training of users, both of the tool and of using the outputs of it. And then I just want to point out some of the challenges for these teams that are developing tools. There are some real challenges, is that the expertise and the effort and the production of some of these things that enhance the utility of tools are not the physical sciences and the software development expertise. And there's a real a challenge for them to try to take on thinking about utility and implementing some of the things that are needed to enhance utility. And there's maybe we have to be cautious about just expanding the scope for them and their projects. So in thinking about how we can connect or increase the utility of these tools in ways that are practical, that just don't really expand the scope too much for the team. I think it would be worth spending some time thinking about that. So with that, I'll close and open for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. That was really great. Tasha, I'm going to let you take back control, and then search team members, I will unmute you.
Okay, control of the screen.
Yes.
Great. Okay, make sure I have, hold on. Okay. That you should.
So we'll open it up first to the CERC team members. You should be off mute.
Holly, this is Denise.
Mm-hmm.
That was great again. And I do like the framework. It helps us think about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I, again, wish we had thought about this harder before we started. But I think one of the things I'd like to talk about is how do we move into the decision support tool teams to start thinking about integrating some of this information besides your consults and your meetings with them.
Yeah, and I think that, again, establishing maybe a checklist and helping or working with each of the teams to say what is kind of their current state of affairs for different parts of their tools. So answering some of those questions, what networks are you connected with? What specific decision processes are your tools being used for now? How are you handling the interoperability of taking outputs from one tool and into yours, and then are you connecting with other tools that are taking yours as input? How are you packaging things? How are you connected with policies and programs? That is, do any organizations have your tool as part of kind of what's their official toolkit for looking at challenges and making decisions? Just doing a simple inventory is a place to start, I would say. Does that help?
Right. Yep, that helps.
Anybody else on the search team? Okay, anybody else who has a question, type it into the question box. Remember to add your affiliation, and you definitely just saw me send a message that was meant to be to CBI, thanking them for their help in these last minute changes.
Holly, this is Denise again. I also would like to take a look again at the CBI website, because it looks like they've done a really nice organizing job, which we probably need to think about as well. And we can work with Nate on that for our website. I don't think we have as much data or as many maps, but I might be wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's a good idea. Is taking a look at that, the CBI stuff, and seeing where CERC stuff could fit into that, or what you can pull out of the CBI experience to bring to the CERC, to the CERC tools. And I don't want to neglect the U.S. Water Toolbox and the Climate Resiliency Toolkit. I don't think we can neglect those. My own view is that those are still just a little too random. We hear that from our Carpe Diem West members, is that there's not enough structure for them to figure out how to actually use the tools to connect with their decision processes. So there's still a lot that does need to be done with tools, but I really like some of the CBI, looking at the guides and the galleries in particular.
And for those who aren't familiar, this is Tasha, I'll jump in. The galleries and the guides and case studies she's referring to can be found at databasin, databasin.org. And underneath Explore, you can look at the different resources and browse some examples and recommended content.
So this is the last call for questions, but I'm not hearing any from the larger group. Remember that this will be edited and then posted online, so you'll have a chance to revisit it or send it to any of your other colleagues. But I wanted to, again, thank Holly for giving us this really great webinar, and thank you to Tasha for a lot of control behind the scenes, especially some last minute changes.
Yep.
CBI is a fantastic partner, and we're coming up on lunch on Pacific time, so I will let you go a little bit early. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.